As we say here at Texas A&M, howdy. Howdy. Welcome. I see my partner in crime, Max Angerholzer, back there, so I'd like to recognize him. And then Ambassador Mosbacher, lovely program last night. It was a pleasure. So I'd like to welcome Ambassador Barco to the Bush Library and Museum. And we appreciate your father's long career of public service and are so pleased that you have chosen the Bush Presidential Library and Museum as a recipient of the books commemorating that career on the 100th anniversary of his birth. As President Bush said, there can be no definition of a successful life without service to others, and your father, President Barco, is a great example of that service. And the books that you will give us today will go into our archive, and so we're so pleased. And I'd like to welcome to the podium my colleague at the Bush School, Raymond Robertson.
Howdy. It's such an honor for us to be here today. I'm Raymond Robertson. I'm the director of the Mosbacher Institute and a professor over at the Bush School. And it's truly an honor for us today to be here with Ambassador Carolina Barco, who has demonstrated a lifelong career of public service and is a true example for all of our students. I know that every time she's come and interacted with our students that they leave very inspired to lead a better life. We wanted to thank you very much for that. I'd also like to just, for those of you who are not as familiar with Ambassador Barco, I'd like to just share a little bit about her background so that you're aware of the stellar example she's been providing, because she's served for over 30 years in senior public policy and diplomatic positions. She was Colombia's foreign minister from 2002 to 2006 during President Alvaro Uribe's first term, and ambassador to the United States from 2006 to 2010. As ambassador, she focused on seeking the approval of the free trade agreement with the United States and continued socioeconomic and security cooperation with Plan Colombia and return of the Peace Corps to Colombia. Recently, she was Colombia's ambassador to the Kingdom of Spain during 2019 and 2020. Previously, she was a consultant for 8 years with the Inter-American Development Bank and directly involved with creating and implementing the Emerging and Sustainable Cities program in over 60 mid-sized cities in Latin America and the Caribbean. That program provided parameters and concrete proposals for more sustainable financial, social, and environmental development. The group of cities was the foundation for the IDB's Latin American and Caribbean Cities Network, which strengthens communications among cities to enable peer learning. And for those of you who've been in Latin America, you know how important this really is. Previously in Colombia, she was the director of city planning in the city of Bogota, implementing the first 10-year regional and urban plan, and she also had headed several UNDP programs in the Housing and Ministry of Economic Development and the Historic Towns program at the Cultural Ministry. At the University of the Andes, she was the director of the research program on the development of Bogota and its surrounding region. Truly a counterpart to the Bush School and everything we stand for. It's been really amazing in her career. She received her bachelor's from Wellesley College here in the United States and a master's in city planning from the Graduate School of Design at Harvard University and an executive MBA from the Instituto de Empresa. She was a fellow at the Spurs program at MIT. She has a large number of awards from practically every Latin American country, which is incredibly impressive. And please join me in welcoming Ambassador Carolina Barco.
Sorry, yes, why don't we? Thank you. So, with those such warm and welcome words, how can I not be so pleased to be here? And I always feel so welcome every time I come, and it's such a pleasure, and you just have a wonderful university, an incredible student body. Yesterday I was able to sit on these classes with Ambassador Zelik, and just to see their interest in public service. It's we were commenting with Ambassador Zelik, it's so wonderful to be in this environment. It continues to inspire, and so thank you very much for inviting me. So I wanted to thank you and thank Mr. Finch for receiving these books that we're bringing today, this donation On behalf of my siblings, I have 2 sisters, Diana and Julia, and a brother called Virgilio. And so I'm here in representation of the family. And we wanted to bring these books here because the Bush School and Library are clearly a place of continued study of history, of international relations, political science, and embody and exalt the fundamental importance of public service. Colombia has a tradition of celebrating the centennial of our presidents. And with this, during that year, there are a series of events that permit the country to register again, analyze, and highlight their lives of public service. Last year was President Barco's centennial. He was born on the 17th of September in 1921 and dedicated his whole life to public service. He was elected to the City Council of Cúcuta, which was his birthplace in a city that nobody knew until now, because as you know, this is the place where so many of the migrants coming from Venezuela are entering Colombia. So it's a place where we have a lot of international organization helping us to address this issue. So he was from Cúcuta, was a city council member at age 22, and from there he continued on a career to be senator, representative. He participated in many governments, being a minister of public works, minister of agriculture. He was the mayor of Bogotá. He was also ambassador to the US for one time and twice in Great Britain, and he was the executive director of Colombia to the World Bank. So also a very sort of diverse kind of service, but always to the public sector and very, very committed. He was president from 1986 to 1990, therefore overlapping with President George Herbert Walker Bush's term, with whom he developed a very important friendship and a very important working relationship to face one of the most decisive moments for Colombia's history and democracy. President Duque organized a year-long commemoration with a special event on the day of his birthday, in which he had people from different sectors and different moments of his life come and talk about what President Barco's life had meant, either in that sector, that place, that moment, or for their sort of development. There was a production of 2 documentaries, podcasts, 2 photographic exhibitions, a 3-volume book called Virgilio Barco Homenaje, which I think translates in English to Virgilio Barco, a homage or a tribute. And although all these analyses that we're talking about, the documentaries, the podcasts, etc., were all very important, I think that for my father, the book would be the most important for him, because he was somebody who believed in the written word. He felt that what was not written, what was not registered, what was not in our archives, would not be remembered and would not allow us to understand our history and our country. And so he was firmly a believer in that, and we'll see that in his presidency, what he did was pass a law to create the first law to create a national archive in Colombia, and we're talking about 1988. So that I think for him, this book is very important, and leaving this book here in this library and with in this institution that you have here in the United States, NARA, which is so fantastic, I think it is such an appropriate place for it to be. The book, Virgilio Barco, a homage, a tribute, was edited by Fernando Cepeda, a well-known political scientist and a member of President Barco's cabinet, and Mario Tadeo, also a respected historian and a lawyer. They decided to identify 7 legacies of Virgilio Barco's public life. Some of these legacies he worked on during his whole life, and others were very particular to his presidency. And what they did was follow his example. President Barco, because he believed in the written word, every year a president in Colombia has to hand over a report to Congress. And my father would oversee the content of that report and the annexes, the appendices that there were, so that they would include the most important documents that were what allowed or developed these different policies. So what Fernando and Marino did was, one, sort of reflect on what were these important legacies throughout his life, and then seek the documents that they felt were most important. So this book will have at each one of the beginning a short explanation of what was important about that legacy, and then the documents that allow you to understand how they were implemented. So I think it's an important combination, because it's not just an interpretation. The documents are there to be studied and analyzed. They also, in their book, they also picked up press conferences or reports that came out, because that also shows how what the reaction was to many of these proposals and how that was interpreted. So let's go through the 7 legacies very quickly. The first one was called, it's National Infrastructure, Regional and Urban Development. President Barco was an engineer, a civil engineer, an economist from MIT. And he brought this training and discipline to his various ministries. When he was Minister of Public Works, he developed a very important network of trains in our northern coast, and also a network of roads. When he was Minister of Agriculture, he built a series of irrigation projects that were fundamental for agriculture in different areas of the country. And as a mayor of Bogota, he totally transformed the city at that moment, bringing all modern lighting, aqueduct, and services, and investing especially in the poor parts of country. We're talking about the mayor in the 60s. This was a time when there was a huge rural-urban migration in Latin America, and our countries were growing at a 7% growth rate annual, which meant they were doubling their population every 11 years. So it was necessary to reach out and put in all these networks, and as he said, this is where he spent the most time and all his money, and nobody could see what he'd done. But it was fundamental in changing the life and the city. The second legacy has to do with historical memory, culture, and national archives. So he was very important in creating sort of a historical monuments program to identify buildings, which are also an important way of understanding our history. And he had been aware as he went through his different places of work that the archives, that there was not a national archive, that they were not organized, and he always tried to leave that set up. So when he came in, he knew this was one of his priorities. He had some documents, he'd been studying how the archives worked in other countries. And so during his presidency in 1989, we passed Ley 80, which created our National Archive. He built the first, our building of our National Archive, and the designer was Rogelio Salmona, a very well-known Colombian architect. And it developed the parameters for archives at a national, regional, and local level. This has now been developed further, but it was a very important moment for us to realize that we needed to conserve and save in a very organized way all of these documents to really understand and learn from history as we went forward. The third legacy they called Sustainable Development and Eradication of Extreme Poverty. If you had asked my father before going, during his campaign and when he started his presidency, what was it he really wanted to work on? It was eradicating extreme poverty, the poorest groups of Colombians, addressing programs to them. And he had prepared all his life for that. That was what he had focused on as mayor. When he was at the World Bank, he worked very hard, and McNamara sort of made fun and enjoyed my father, who apparently was very, very participatory in the meetings, talking about what were the real parameters of poverty and what countries should be doing, etc. But we will see that when he came in, our biggest challenge at that moment was drug trafficking. So he continued with these programs, but he wasn't able to spend the kind of time that he would have liked to, because he had to make sure that the country continued to be viable and that our democracy continued. He did address programs of poverty not only in urban areas, but in rural areas, and that continues to be one of our main challenges. It has to do with cadastres, with land tenure, and programs for our rural areas, good communications, etc. The fourth legacy, defense of the Amazon and rights of the indigenous communities and their territories. In this manner, we're talking about 1986, he was really forward-looking because he became very concerned about what was happening in the Amazon and realized that the people who best took care of the Amazon were the indigenous communities living there. They knew that the fragility of the Amazon, which is so large, you have the idea, and it's so strong, but it's a very fragile ecosystem, has incredible biodiversity, and so what he did was he recognized these indigenous communities, their rights, and gave them rights over these lands for them to take care of them and protect them. And 30 years later, the analyses that have been made show that these are the best preserved areas where there is the greatest biodiversity. And just this week, a couple of days ago, we found out that there's a process to name one of these parks after my father, and in recognition of the fact that he was the first to assume this focus, which subsequent presidents have continued to work on, and Colombia has been very, very active and continues to be very active in the defense of the Amazon, which is fundamental for the world and for all of us. Then he was important also in a political way, implementing a two-party government system after a period in which Colombia had assumed a very interesting exercise. In the 30s and 40s, we developed a situation of political strife between our parties, and it grew to an incredible high level of violence. So the leaders of the two main parties got together and decided that for 4 periods, 16 years, they would share the government, and that way we would decrease this confrontation. So the first president was liberal, the second would be conservative, liberal, conservative, and half of the cabinet would be liberal, half conservative, half of the governors liberal, half of the conservative, and the same for the mayors of the major cities. That worked so well that after those 4 periods, the following presidents decided they really didn't want to change the system, so for 4 more periods, we continued with the same system. By the time my father got to be president, he was very worried that our democracy had become about how we were distributing positions and not about our policies. And he felt that this was very detrimental to democracy, that for democracy it's important to have very clear policies and debate. So he won with a very large majority. He was a liberal candidate. So he won by 70%. He offered then 30% of the positions to the Conservative Party. He said, okay, well, I'll invite you to participate in a proportional manner. They did not find this acceptable, so he had a liberal government, which we have found was very important for Colombia then to get back on point and having a democracy where we're having this debate. The 7th legacy is the one that turned out to be the most important, and where the relationship with President George Herbert Walker Bush and his team was absolutely fundamental, which was our international relations and the fight against narco-terrorism. As Ambassador Zelig mentioned last night in his presentation, Colombia had to make a very firm and brave decision, and that was to fight back against the drug lords, who felt, and they'd gotten to a point where they had so much wealth, they had control of so many groups, that they felt that they could push their way and do whatever they wanted in the country. And they resorted to terrorism, killing, maiming, kidnapping. When my father came in, Pablo Escobar had just killed the justice minister of his predecessor, President Betancourt, because that was the Conservative Party, because they did not accept him in their party. And since they didn't accept him in this party, even though he had been elected to Congress, he killed the justice minister. My father comes in this very difficult moment, and within the first 4 months of his presidency, they've killed the president, the head of the major newspaper in Colombia. And from there on, as my father said, every day he did not have sort of a set schedule, because every day there was some emergency. Of course, he had his program. He was a very organized person, and the programs went on. But his focus ended up being on fighting this very, very challenging and terrific moment in Colombia. So he, I mean, just to give you a feeling, not only did they kill ministers, they killed the prosecutor general. During my father's presidency, they killed 3 presidential candidates. They downed an airplane. On Mother's Day, they put bombs in commercial centers. They put dynamite in children's school, my children's school. I mean, they were out there to fight for control of Colombia, and we had to be very firm. And that was hard because it was scary, and for people it was very, very difficult to live under these conditions. But my father found and used an extradition treaty that we had with the United States. By chance, when he had been ambassador to Washington in 1977 to 79, he had been important in negotiating this treaty and was able to use it. Little did he know then that he would be using it, that would be so important. But he also knew that he couldn't fight this alone, and that the issue of drug trafficking was an issue that involved both production, which is where Colombia was involved in that part, but also consumption, because consumption was driving the production. And so he went out to talk to different leaders about the importance of having a policy of shared responsibility. In this issue, we all had a responsibility. Those countries that were consumers, those countries that were producers, and at that moment, Colombia was not a producer of coca, but it was the place where it was transformed and where the largest drug traffickers were at that moment. So President Barco came to Washington and met with President Bush on the 20th of September of 1989, met with members of Congress, and they talked about this shared responsibility and the importance both of consumption and production. And President Bush was very, very open and to this focus, and this is part of his policies that here in the States reflected this position. And so they continued the conversation. My father then went on to the United Nations to make an international appeal, that internationally we look at it that way, because at that moment, America had a problem with coca and cocaine, and Europe and Asia had a problem with heroin. At that point, they're almost like 2 different worlds. Now, as you know, everything's just so mixed, and on top of that we have chemical drugs. But it was important to talk internationally about this international challenge that we had to our democracies and our governments. And President Bush assumed the responsibility, and he organized a trip and a meeting in Cartagena. Cartagena and Colombia at that moment was one of the most dangerous countries in the world. So for President Bush to say that he was going to have a meeting and he was going to go to Cartagena, he was going to show that we could meet there, was really very, very courageous. And Rob and I have had conversations with people who were in his staff, and clearly he was instrumental in making sure that this trip took place. And there was a wonderful story of one of his staffers who wanted to come along. And President Bush felt a little bit responsible. He said, "You write to your mother and say that, ask for her permission, and you can come along with me." And which just goes to show, one, how humane he was, but the other, how willing he was to assume these responsibilities. And so they came to Cartagena. They met then at that point with Alan Garcia, who was the president of Peru, and Paz Zamora, who was the president of Bolivia. These were the 2 largest coca producing countries, with President Barco from Colombia, the country that was important in transforming it and trafficking it, and the US. When you read the statement, the commitment that there was to fight, to look at it in this more as a shared responsibility comes out, and it was very important. All these documents, the summaries of the meetings between the presidents in Washington, the meetings with Congress, and these are in the book. So these are part of the documents that were chosen to be part of the book. And this then turned into, as President Bush left, he had a conversation with his team and decided that it was very important to offer alternatives of economic opportunities to the producers of coca. And so that's when he pushed, and Congress was very open to approving the ATPDA, which is the Andean Trade Preference System, which allowed us to bring most of our exports tariff-free into the United States to make it easier for us to sell our products. And originally it was for 10 years, and later it was prolonged. And then we saw the benefit of making this something that was secure, because then you would have investment instead of wondering, is it going to be prolonged 2 more years or 1 more year? And so that's when we started working on the free trade agreements. And I was part of the team with President Uribe, who met with Ambassador Zellick to talk about the beginning of the free trade agreement with the United States. Ambassador Zellick is fantastic because he said, you know, we want to do this, but it's not easy. He wasn't going to sugarcoat anything. And I think that's what makes him so effective, because you know where you stand, and he's so clear about how things were going to work. He said, we're friends, but we are negotiating. So we have to understand that that is the position. And in 2012, we did pass the free trade agreement, and it's been working. You know, we continue to work to make it flow better, but it's been very, very important. So this is the first book that I am leaving. Then there were 2 other biographies that just came out in the last 2 years. And one was by Malcolm Dease, who's a renowned English historian from Oxford University, but he's also a Colombian specialist. And he went to Colombia towards the end of my father's term. And my father, sort of tongue-in-cheek, but I think it was a serious question, said, how do you think history is going to judge me? And so he said, time will tell. So 30 years later, he wrote his book. And his book is called, I'm going to read it in Spanish and then I'll translate. Barco, vida y sucesos de un presidente crucial y del mundo violento que enfrentó. Which means Barco, life and events of a crucial president and the violent world he faced. It is Malcolm Dease's conclusion that President Barco, by being so clear, straightforward, and fighting back, was crucial to Colombia's democracy, because drug traffickers realized that they couldn't terrorize us into submission. And that brought the Colombian society together, and we realized what kind of a horrible criminal activity and groups we had there. Because at the beginning, because they had so much money and they built schools and things, they were seen as Robin Hoods. But all of a sudden you realize that these were wolves, really fierce wolves, with sheepskin. And so it was fundamental for Colombia, and has continued to be fundamental for us, to maintain this very strict and clear fight against drug trafficking, which continues and is one of the big challenges that we continue to have. The other book is a biography by a Colombian, a well-known historian called Leopoldo Villar Borda. And his book is much more like a chronological biography, explains how people, what my father's life was and what he did in each one of these, but also stresses his values, the fact that he was a liberal president, somebody very open to discussion, to listening to others, to very concerned with the social issues of the country, and that this was also very, very important. So from this presentation, I hope that it's clear why my family is so grateful and pleased to be able to donate these books to this incredible institution, to the Bush Library, and to provide some insight into another example of President Bush's commitment to democracy and the friendship that and commitment to friendship also, to the region and to the U.S.'s special friend, Colombia. And I say this a special friend because this year we are celebrating the 200 years of the relationship between the United States and Colombia. Colombia was the first country to be recognized from a Latin American country by the United States. And so we have called it, both sides, a special relationship. It's 200 years of a special relationship, and so we're carrying out a series of documents and events to commemorate it. So I think this is another example of how the special relationship has played out at different moments, and what an important role President George Herbert Walker Bush and his team had, and how grateful Colombia is for the support we received at that very crucial moment, and for the kind of support that we have continued to receive through Plan Colombia, and to work together. I think we have a relationship that has been very important bilaterally, but also for the region, and I think we are addressing global issues together now of sustainability, related to the environment, related to development, which are also fundamental. So thank you very, very much for this invitation. Thank you very much for organizing this. I want to thank all of those who worked in the Mosbacher Institute, Jennifer, and all your team. All of you, unfortunately, I don't know all of you, but I want to thank you very much. I've been here since yesterday, and it's really exciting to see what you're doing here. And so congratulations, and thank you very, very much.
Thank you very much. So the books will go into our library in the archives, so people can come in and use them. Appreciate it. And I believe we've got a slideshow here to show. So if we can begin that.
My mother, this is my sister Diana, and my brother and my sister Julia, who I am representing. Okay, so my father, my sister Diana, she also went to MIT. She's an architect, very involved in in architecture and social issues. My brother Virgilio works with Acumen, also on programs of social investment, of social impact. And my sister Julia, there's my mother. And there I am. So the book, these are the 3 volumes of the book that the President Duque brought out, that has the 7 legacies, that has a description and the documents. So this is one that I am sure my father is very, very pleased that came out. This is the one by Malcolm Dease, which is interesting because what he does, my father was so particular about saving everything. When he went up to MIT, he wrote letters to his father, and his father wrote letters to him. He kept all his letters. His father kept all his letters. So we now have the whole correspondence in the 4 years that he was at MIT. Then when he dated my mother, she saved all his letters, and he saved all his letters. So we have all that correspondence also.
Unfortunately, Mrs. Bush didn't. She hit the middle one.
Okay, well, yes, no, then you wonder what to do with them. So what's interesting is that Malcolm, instead of doing just a chronological biography, decided to choose different moments of my father's life to talk a little bit about the history of Colombia. So in the first chapter, he just talked about Colombia through the eyes of his correspondent. Later, when my father was dating my mother, that we're already in the period of violence. And my father was being persecuted. He lived in an area that was where it was mostly conservative. He was liberal. And so they had to get married earlier, almost about 6 months earlier. And so he talks about the violence, also using part of his correspondence. Then he talks about my father's time as mayor, because it really was very transformational for Bogota, to talk about how this more modern view of the city came through with what he was able to accomplish in 3 years. Pope Paul VI went to Bogota at that time. So you know, when you have these special events, somehow it just gives you the opportunity to do things. A city might be thinking, but then this really pushes it. And so that was fundamental. And then the last chapter is about his presidency. So it's an interesting way to see history in a different way. And this is the one which is very true to, he did a lot of research, and what he tells is just my father's history, but also the values that represent it. So I hope you enjoy them.
Thank you very much.
You're going to have to study Spanish also. But there's a lot of people who speak Spanish in Latin America, so that's a good investment of time.
So I just, your father's legacy is great, but as an archivist and I'm part of the National Archives, maybe one of his greatest legacies is starting the National Archives in Colombia, because history is very important. And if you don't know your history, you make the same mistakes over and over again. So that's kind of close to my heart, the National Archives. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you all of y'all for joining us today. Appreciate y'all being